The echo of sneakers against polished wood has always been the sound of home to me. Even now, years later, I can close my eyes and hear it perfectly, that distinctive squeak and slide that only comes from a basketball court after hours, when the bleachers are empty and the overhead lights cast everything in harsh, honest shadows. On that particular Tuesday night in March, I was alone in the gym, or I thought I was. Practice had ended 20 minutes earlier, but I stayed behind, as I often did, shooting free throws until my shoulders burned and my hands went numb from the cold leather. The rest of the team had filtered out in their usual pattern. Loud voices echoing down the hallway, locker doors slamming, the distant rumble of car engines starting in the parking lot. I preferred this quiet aftermath, this space where I could exist without performance or expectation. My breath still came in short bursts from the 2 hours of conditioning we'd endured. Coach Williams had been particularly brutal that evening, running us through drill after drill until Marcus nearly threw up in the corner, and even Grant, our unshakable team captain, had sweat dripping from his chin like rain. But that was March for us. Conference championships loomed 3 weeks away, and Williams had made it clear that anything less than perfection would be a failure we'd carry for the rest of our lives. I bounced the ball twice, set my feet, and released. The shot arced high and fell through the net with that satisfying whisper that every basketball player learns to love. 16 out of 20 so far. Not bad, but not good enough. Nothing ever felt good enough anymore. The gymnasium was vast when empty like this. During games, it filled with 3,000 screaming fans, pep band music, and the kind of electric energy that made your skin tingle. But now, in the silence, it felt almost sacred. The championship banners hung motionless from the rafters, shadows of teams and victories from decades past. I had dreamed of adding to that collection since I was 12 years old, shooting hoops in my driveway, until my mother called me in for dinner. That dream felt both closer and further away than ever. I retrieved the ball and moved to the opposite side of the court, trying to clear my mind the way Coach had taught us. Focus on the rim. Nothing else exists. Not the pressure, not the expectations, not the gnawing uncertainty that had been eating at me for weeks. Just the ball, the rim, and the perfect arc between them. But as I set up for my 17th shot, I heard it, the heavy thud of the gymnasium door closing. Not the gentle swing of someone leaving, but the deliberate push of someone entering. My stomach tightened. I had been certain everyone was gone. I turned, ball still cradled in my hands, and saw Grant standing near the entrance. He hadn't showered yet. His practice jersey was still damp with sweat, clinging to the broad frame that had made him first-team all-conference 2 years running. His dark hair was messy, pushed back from his forehead in a way that revealed the intensity in his eyes, an intensity that had been growing sharper each day as the season progressed. Grant Mitchell was the kind of man other men wanted to be. At 22, he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no, never been made to doubt his place in any room he entered. On the court, he was ruthless, driving to the basket with a ferocity that left defenders scrambling in crowds on their feet. Off the court, he was magnetic in a way that seemed effortless, quick to laugh, quick to lead, the first-person teammates looked to when games got tight or spirits got low. I had been watching him for 3 years, first as an awestruck freshman who could barely believe he was sharing a locker room with Grant Mitchell, then as a teammate who earned his respect through countless hours of extra practice and quiet dedication. Somewhere along the way, admiration had shifted into something else entirely, something I had been trying very hard not to name. He walked across the court with that distinctive stride of his, purposeful, unhurried, like he owned every inch of space he moved through. His sneakers made their own rhythm against the wood, a counterpoint to my heartbeat, which had suddenly become loud enough to hear. "Why are you still here?" I wanted to ask, but the words caught in my throat. Grant had made it clear over the past few weeks that our interactions were becoming complicated. The casual touches that had once been natural between teammates, a hand on the shoulder, a congratulatory chest bump after a good play, had begun to linger too long. Eye contact across the court had started to feel like something more than strategy. And in the locker room, where we had always been comfortable in our shared space, silence had grown heavy and strange. I had told myself, it was the pressure of the season. The stress of championships and expectations could make anyone feel unsettled. But watching Grant approach me now, seeing something almost predatory in the way he moved, I knew this was something else entirely. He stopped about 10 feet away from me, close enough that I could see the rise and fall of his chest, could smell the familiar mixture of sweat and the cologne he always wore practice. His jaw was tight, like he was holding back words that wanted to force their way out. "What are you still doing here?" I finally managed to say, though my voice came out quieter than I had intended. Grant didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, something raw and hungry and desperate. Then he turned toward the gymnasium door, walked to it with that same measured stride, and pushed it closed with a sound that seemed to echo forever in the empty space. The click of the lock engaging was impossibly loud. When he turned back to face me, something had shifted in his expression. The careful control he usually maintained had cracked, revealing something underneath that made my pulse race and my mouth go dry. He took a step closer, then another, until there were only a few feet between us. The basketball in my hands suddenly felt like dead weight. "No one needs to know how badly I want this," he said, and his voice was low and rough, like he had been fighting those words for a long time. The sentence hung in the air between us, more dangerous than any confession I had ever heard. I felt my chest tighten, felt something electric shoot through me that had nothing to do with the game we played every day and everything to do with the game we had been playing for weeks without acknowledging it. I didn't know if I should run for the door or take a step toward him. I didn't know if what I was feeling was terror or relief or something else entirely. All I knew was that the sound of that lock clicking had changed something fundamental in the space between us, and there would be no pretending otherwise. The ball slipped from my hands and bounced once, twice, before rolling away into the shadows. Neither of us moved to retrieve it. I had always been the steady one. That's what everyone said about me. Teammates, coaches, professors, the handful of friends I had managed to keep outside the consuming world of collegiate basketball. Jameson Reed, they would say, reliable as sunrise. The kind of player you could count on to show up early, stay late, and execute every play exactly as drawn up. At 21, I had built my entire identity around that dependability. But standing there in that locked gymnasium, watching Grant's chest rise and fall in the harsh overhead light, I felt anything but steady. I was a junior, 3 years deep into a basketball career that had defined every choice I had made since high school. My days followed a rhythm so precise it had become second nature. 6 a.m. conditioning, 8 a.m. classes, afternoon practice, evening study sessions that stretched until my eyes burned from reading playbooks and psychology textbooks. I was majoring in sports psychology, partly because it felt practical for someone who lived and breathed athletics, and partly because I had always been fascinated by what drove people to push past their limits. The irony wasn't lost on me now. Our university was the kind of place that worshiped basketball with religious devotion. Nestled in a college town where the population doubled on game days, where local businesses closed early so employees could make it to tip-off, where a good season meant economic prosperity and a bad one meant long, cold winters of disappointment. The pressure was constant, suffocating, beautiful in its intensity. Grant and I had been teammates for 3 years, but our relationship had been built slowly, carefully, like something constructed from materials that might shatter if handled too roughly. When I first arrived as a scrawny 18-year-old from a small town 2 hours north, Grant was already a legend, a sophomore who had started every game his freshman year, whose name was whispered in the same breath as players who had gone on to professional careers. I had been in awe of him then. We all were. But Grant had a way of making everyone feel essential, valued, part of something larger than themselves. He would stay after practice to work with younger players, would remember details about our lives that surprised us, asking about sick relatives, celebrating good grades, showing up with coffee when he knew we had been up all night studying. That was Grant's gift and his curse. He made people love him without trying, and then carried the weight of their expectations like stones in his pockets. Our friendship had grown in the margins, Late-night shooting sessions when the gym was supposed to be closed, study groups that turned into philosophical discussions about everything except basketball, long drives to away games where conversation flowed easier than it did in the bright light of day. Grant was different when it was just the two of us. Less performative, more thoughtful. He would talk about books he was reading, about places he wanted to travel after graduation, about the strange loneliness that came with being the person everyone else looked to for answers. Somewhere in those quiet moments, admiration had transformed into something more dangerous. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it happened. Maybe during a road trip to Michigan, when we had shared a hotel room, and I had watched him sleep, studying the vulnerable curve of his neck in the pre-dawn darkness. Maybe during a particularly brutal practice when he had pulled me aside and told me I was stronger than I gave myself credit for, his hand lingering on my shoulder until I forgot how to breathe properly. Or maybe it had been building all along, like pressure behind a dam, and I had simply been too terrified to acknowledge it. Grant was 22, 8 months older than me, with the kind of presence that made rooms feel smaller when he entered them. He was tall, but not enormous by basketball standards, 6'4" with broad shoulders and the lean muscle that came from years of disciplined training. His dark hair was always slightly too long, falling across his forehead in a way that made him look younger than his age when he smiled. But it was his eyes that people remembered, dark brown, almost black in certain light, with an intensity that could make you feel like you were the only person in the world. On the court, Grant was ruthless. He played with a controlled violence that intimidated opponents and inspired teammates. He could read defenses like literature, finding weaknesses and exploiting them with surgical precision. But it was his leadership that set him apart. Other players would run through walls for him, not because he demanded it, but because he made them believe they were capable of more than they had ever imagined. Off the court, Grant was more complicated. He was studying business, though I suspected it was more because it seemed practical than because he felt passionate about it. He came from money, not wealthy exactly, but comfortable in a way that meant he had never worried about scholarships or student loans. His parents were good people, supportive but distant, the kind who attended every home game but struggled to have conversations that went deeper than statistics and game recaps. Grant carried himself with confidence, but I had begun to notice cracks in that facade. The way his jaw would tighten when certain topics came up in conversation. The way he would disappear for hours without explanation, returning with the kind of restless energy that suggested he had been running from something. The way he looked at me sometimes when he thought I wasn't paying attention, like he was trying to solve a problem he couldn't quite define. For weeks now, the air between us had been charged with something unspoken. Every interaction felt loaded with possibility and danger. A casual touch during practice would send electricity through me that had nothing to do with static and everything to do with what. Eye contact across the locker room would stretch until one of us looked away first, cheeks burning with the intensity of whatever was building between us. I had told myself it was imagination, wishful thinking, the kind of desperate longing that could make you see romance in friendship and desire and simple camaraderie. But standing there in that locked gymnasium, watching Grant watch me with hungry eyes and hearing his confession hanging in the air like smoke, I knew I had been lying to myself. The truth was simpler and more terrifying than any story I had invented. Grant wanted me, and I wanted him back, and everything else. Our team, our futures, the carefully constructed lives we had built around the game we loved suddenly felt fragile as glass. The tension had been building for weeks before that night in the locked gymnasium. It started small, almost imperceptible, glances that lasted a heartbeat too long during team meetings, the way Grant's hand would find my shoulder during huddles and linger there until Coach Williams called for the next play. I told myself it was leadership, nothing more. Grant was our captain. This was how he motivated his players. But the signs were becoming impossible to ignore. During scrimmages, when we were matched against each other, Grant played with an intensity that bordered on personal. He would guard me closer than necessary, his chest nearly touching mine as I tried to post up, his breath warm against my neck as he whispered defensive adjustments that sounded more like invitations. When I managed to score over him, his congratulations came with a look that made my stomach flip. When he scored on me, His celebration felt like a claim being staked. In the weight room, he began positioning himself where he could watch me work. I would catch his reflection in the mirrors, studying the way my muscles moved under the strain of heavy sets, and when our eyes met in the glass, he wouldn't look away. Instead, he would hold my gaze until I was the one who broke contact, my face burning with something I couldn't name. The locker room became a minefield. Grant had always been comfortable with casual nudity the way most athletes were, changing clothes without thought, walking to the showers with the easy confidence of someone who had never been made to feel ashamed of his body. But now I found myself hyper-aware of every moment when he was undressed, every glimpse of skin that felt like something stolen. Worse, I began to notice him watching me with the same hungry attention, his eyes tracking the movement of my hands as I pulled off my practice jersey, lingering on the curve of my back as I bent to untie my shoes. The silence in those moments was deafening. Where locker rooms were usually filled with the constant chatter of 20 young men, jokes and complaints and discussions about everything from classes to girls to weekend plans, the space between Grant and me had become charged with unspoken tension. Other teammates seemed to sense it without understanding it, giving us a wider berth, their conversations dying when they noticed the way we looked at each other. Coach Williams, thankfully, remained oblivious. He was focused entirely on the approaching conference championships, drilling us through plays until we could execute them in our sleep, pushing our conditioning until even Grant was gasping for air. But I could see Marcus and Tyler exchanging glances when they thought we weren't looking, could hear the questions in their voices when they asked if everything was okay between the captain and me. Everything was not okay. Everything was spiraling towards something that felt inevitable and terrifying in equal measure. The night everything changed started like any other. Practice had been brutal. 2.5 hours of defensive drills, conditioning, and scrimmaging that left the entire team exhausted. Coach Williams had been particularly harsh, screaming about our lack of focus, our sloppy execution, our failure to understand that winning required sacrifice. By the time he dismissed us, half the team was barely standing. I watched my teammates file out in their usual pattern. Marcus complaining about his sore ankles, Tyler already planning his evening around a video game tournament, the freshmen moving in a pack like they were afraid to be separated. Grant usually left with them, often organizing team dinners or study sessions that reinforced his role as our leader. But tonight, Grant lingered. I had stayed behind to work on my free throws, a ritual that had become sacred to me over the years. The gym after practice was my sanctuary, a place where I could exist without performance or expectation. I assumed Grant would leave with the others, would follow his usual pattern of leadership and camaraderie. Instead, he began gathering loose basketballs from around the court, his movements casual but deliberate. When I asked if he needed help, he shook his head without looking at me. When I asked if something was wrong, he didn't answer at all. The silence stretched between us like a wire-pulled taut. I continued shooting, trying to focus on my form, but I was hyper-aware of his presence. He moved around the gym with purpose, checking that equipment was properly stored, that nothing was left out that shouldn't be. But his movements felt performative, like he was looking for reasons to stay without having to explain why. When the last of our teammates' voices faded from the hallway, when the parking lot outside grew quiet, Grant finally spoke. "Is everyone gone?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. "I think so," I replied, my voice sounding strange in the empty space. That's when he walked to the door. Not hurried, not hesitant, but with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he had been planning this moment. The sound of the heavy door closing echoed through the gymnasium like a gunshot. The click of the lock engaging was even louder. When he turned back to face me, something fundamental had shifted in his expression. The careful control he maintained during practice, the easy confidence he wore like armor, had cracked open to reveal something raw and desperate underneath. He walked toward me with that same measured pace, each step deliberate, until he was close enough that I could see the rapid rise and fall of his chest, could smell the familiar mixture of sweat and cologne that I had begun associating with sleepless nights and guilty thoughts. "No one needs to know how badly I want this," he said, and his voice was rough with weeks of suppressed desire. The words hung in the air between us like a confession, like a challenge, like a door being opened that could never be closed again. My hands trembled around the basketball I was holding, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was certain he could hear it. I didn't know if I should run or stay. I didn't know if what I was feeling was terror or relief or something else entirely. All I knew was that the space between us had become charged with possibility, and that whatever happened next would change everything we had built together. The ball slipped from my hands and bounced away into the shadows, forgotten. After that night, in the locked gymnasium, everything changed, even though nothing had actually happened. Grant's confession hung between us like smoke, visible in every interaction, but impossible to grasp directly. No one needs to know how badly I want this. The words had shattered something fundamental in our dynamic, and now we were both learning to navigate the wreckage of what we had been while trying to build something new from the pieces. The transformation was subtle at first. To our teammates, to Coach Williams, to the casual observer, we were still captain and player, leader and follower, the same combination that had helped drive our team toward what everyone believed would be a championship season. But underneath that familiar surface, a different game was being played entirely. Practice became a battlefield of restraint. Every drill felt loaded with subtext. Every collision on the court charged with electricity that had nothing to do with competition and everything to do with the hunger I'd seen in Grant's eyes that night. When he guarded me during scrimmages, his hands seemed to find excuses to touch, steadying me after a hard foul, helping me up when I hit the floor, adjusting my position during defensive sets with a lingering contact that made my skin burn. The worst moments were when he would demonstrate plays using me as his example. Grant would position himself behind me, his chest pressed against my back as he guided my arms through the proper shooting motion, his breath warm against my neck as he explained footwork and timing. His hands would rest on my hips longer than necessary, and I would lose track of whatever instruction he was giving because all I could focus on was the heat radiating from his body and the way my pulse raced whenever he touched me. During water breaks, he would catch my eye across the court and hold my gaze until I felt like I was drowning. When Coach Williams would praise my improvement, and I was improving, driven by a restless energy I couldn't name, Grant's smile would carry a pride that felt too personal, too intimate for the public setting of team practice. The locker room became an exercise in torture. Grant began timing his showers so that we were often alone together in the steamy space, separated only by a thin partition and the sound of running water. I would try to focus on getting dressed quickly, on gathering my things, and escaping before the silence became too heavy to bear. But Grant seemed determined to draw out these moments, taking his time, humming quietly to himself as if he hadn't just spent 2 hours driving me to distraction with looks and touches that felt like promises. One afternoon, as I was pulling on my street clothes after a particularly intense practice, Grant emerged from the shower area with a towel wrapped around his waist and water still beating on his chest. He moved to his locker, which was directly across from mine, and began getting dressed with deliberate slowness. When I glanced up from tying my shoes, he was watching me in the mirror mounted on his locker door, his dark eyes intense and unreadable. "You staying for extra shooting tonight?" he asked, though it sounded more like a statement than a question. I hadn't planned to, but something in his voice made me nod before I could think better of it. "Good," he said, and the single word carried weight that made my stomach flip. That became our new pattern. Grant would find reasons to keep me after practice, extra conditioning sessions that were supposedly for my benefit, film study meetings that turned into long discussions about strategy and psychology, shooting drills that were ostensibly about improving my form, but felt more like elaborate dances around the tension that was consuming us both. During these sessions, we were careful to maintain the pretense of normal teammate interaction. Grant would critique my shooting technique, offer advice about defensive positioning, share insights about reading opposing players that would help me elevate my game. But underneath the basketball instruction was a different kind of education entirely. He began showing up in places he had never appeared before. At the campus coffee shop where I studied between classes, sliding into the seat across from me with his own textbooks and a casual explanation about needing a change of scenery. At the dining hall during dinner, joining me and my roommate with easy conversation that somehow always steered toward topics that revealed more about who I was outside of basketball. Most unsettling of all, he started appearing in my dormitory. Never with advance warning, never with a clear agenda beyond saying he was in the neighborhood and thought he'd stop by. My roommate, Kevin, seemed delighted by these visits from our team captain, treating Grant like a celebrity guest. But I could see something calculating in Grant's eyes as he took in the details of my living space. The books stacked on my desk, the photographs pinned to my bulletin board, the small personal items that revealed the person I was when no one was watching. These visits felt like reconnaissance missions, like Grant was methodically cataloging every aspect of my life, looking for vulnerabilities or entry points. When he would leave, usually after an hour of casual conversation that revealed nothing and everything, I would lie awake replaying every word, every glance, every moment when his fingers had brushed mine as he handed back a book or adjusted papers on my desk. The most dangerous moments came during team meals or group study sessions, when we were surrounded by our teammates, but still somehow isolated in our own bubble of tension. Grant would find excuses to sit next to me, his thigh pressing against mine under the table, his arm brushing against my shoulder as he reached for salt or pointed at something in a textbook. These touches were brief, could easily be explained as accidental contact in crowded spaces, but they sent electricity through me that made it difficult to concentrate on anything else. I began to realize that Grant's campaign, because that's what it was, a systematic effort to break down my defenses, was working. The fear that had initially paralyzed me was transforming into anticipation. The voice in my head that whispered about consequences and complications was being drowned out by a louder voice that wanted to know what would happen if I stopped running from what we both knew was inevitable. The secrecy was suffocating, but it was also intoxicating. Every shared glance felt like a secret language. Every casual touch carried the weight of unspoken promises. Every moment alone together was charged with possibility that made my heart race and my hands shake. What scared me most was not Grant's intensity, but how much I wanted to surrender to it completely. The confrontation came on a Thursday night in early April, 3 weeks after Grant's confession in the locked gymnasium, 2 weeks before conference championships would determine everything we had worked toward for the past 3 years. I had reached my breaking point. For days, I had been unraveling under the weight of Grant's systematic pursuit. Every practice had become an exercise in restraint that left me exhausted. Every casual encounter outside the gym felt loaded with subtext that made normal conversation impossible. I was sleeping poorly, eating less, losing focus during classes as my mind wandered to dark eyes and lingering touches and the way Grant said my name when he thought no one else was listening. That night, I had gone to the campus recreation center, hoping to find some peace in the smaller gym they kept open for student use. It was nearly midnight, and I assumed I would have the space to myself. I needed to shoot baskets without the weight of Grant's attention, needed to remember what it felt like to play basketball for the simple joy of putting the ball through the hoop. But when I walked into the dimly lit gymnasium, Grant was already there. He was shooting alone at the far end of the court, his form perfect, even in the half-light, the rhythm of his shots creating a meditative pattern that echoed off the empty walls. He was wearing gray sweatpants and a faded t-shirt from our sophomore year championship run, his hair damp with sweat despite the cool air. When he saw me, he didn't seem surprised. In fact, he smiled with a kind of knowing expression that suggested he had been expecting me, had perhaps even orchestrated this encounter. The thought made my stomach twist with a mixture of anger and something else I didn't want to name. I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't pretend that the past few weeks had been about basketball or leadership or team chemistry. Couldn't keep dancing around the electricity that sparked between us every time we were in the same room. "Why me?" I said, my voice echoing in the empty space. The words came out sharper than I had intended, carrying weeks of frustration and confusion and desperate longing. Grant caught the ball after his next shot and turned to face me fully. He didn't pretend not to understand what I was asking. "You could have anyone," I continued, taking a step closer. "Anyone on campus. Hell, anyone in the state, probably. So why me?" The question hung between us like a challenge. I was tired of his careful campaign, tired of the way he had been slowly dismantling my defenses without ever acknowledging what he was doing. If he wanted this, wanted me, then he needed to say it plainly, without the protection of plausible deniability or the safety of subtext. Grant bounced the ball once, twice, then held it against his hip. In the dim light, his expression was unreadable, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened before he spoke. "Because you're the only one I can't stop thinking about," he said, and his voice was rougher than I had ever heard it. The honesty in those words hit me like a physical blow. No careful deflection, no attempt to minimize what he was admitting. Just raw truth delivered with the kind of vulnerability I had never seen from Grant Mitchell, team captain, campus legend, the man everyone else looked to for strength and certainty. He set the ball down and took a step toward me, his dark eyes never leaving mine. "Do you know what it's like," he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "to lie awake every night thinking about someone you can't have? To watch them every day and know exactly how their hands move, how they sound when they laugh, how they look when they think no one is watching. To want something so badly it makes you feel like you're losing your mind." Each word felt like a confession, like he was stripping away layers of protection he had built around himself over years of being the person everyone else needed him to be. And as he spoke, I realized that my own carefully constructed defenses were crumbling just as completely. "I've been thinking about you since sophomore year," he said, taking another step closer. "Since that road trip to Indiana, when you fell asleep against my shoulder in the bus, and I spent 4 hours afraid to move, because I didn't want you to wake up and pull away. Since that night we stayed up until 3 a.m. arguing about whether the Lakers could beat the Celtics in their prime, and you got so passionate about defending your position that I forgot what we were talking about, because all I could focus on was the way your eyes lit up when you cared about something. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. I had remembered both of those moments, had replayed them countless times without understanding why they felt so significant. Now, hearing Grant describe them from his perspective, I felt something shift inside me, a recognition of shared experience, of desire that had been mutual long before either of us had been brave enough to acknowledge it. "You think I chose this," he said, and there was something almost desperate in his voice now. "You think I wanted to feel this way about my teammate, about someone who could destroy everything I've worked for just by existing? You think this is easy for me?" It wasn't a question, but I shook my head anyway, suddenly understanding that Grant's pursuit over the past few weeks hadn't been calculated seduction, but rather the desperate actions of someone who was drowning in feelings he couldn't control. "I dream about you," he said, his voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "I dream about touching you, about what you would sound like if I could make you feel the way you make me feel just by walking into a room. I wake up aching for something I can't have. And then I have to spend the entire day pretending that seeing you doesn't make me want to forget about everything else that matters." The space between us had shrunk to nothing. I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, could smell the familiar mixture of soap and sweat that had become associated with sleepless nights and guilty thoughts. "So don't ask me why he said, reaching up to cup my face with hands that trembled slightly despite his usual steady confidence. "You know why. You've always known why." And standing there in that empty gymnasium at midnight, with Grant's hands on my face and his confession hanging in the air between us like smoke, I realized he was right. I had always known. Standing there with Grant's hands on my face, his confession still echoing in the empty gymnasium, I felt the weight of everything we stood to lose pressing down on us like gravity itself had shifted. The silence stretched between us, heavy with possibility and danger in equal measure. Grant's thumbs traced gentle circles against my cheekbones, and I could feel him waiting, not pushing, not demanding, just holding space for whatever decision would determine the rest of our lives. Because that's what this was, a crossroads where every path forward would exact its own price. I thought about our team, about the 17 other young men who trusted us to lead them towards something greater than any of U.S. could achieve alone. Marcus, who looked up to Grant with a kind of hero worship that bordered on religious devotion. Tyler, who had struggled with confidence until Grant spent countless hours after practice helping him perfect his defensive stance. The freshman who hung on Grant's every word, who had joined his program partly because they wanted to play for the kind of captain who made everyone around him better, if word spread. And in a small college town where basketball was religion and gossip was currency, secrets had a way of becoming public knowledge. Everything could collapse. Not just for us, but for all of them. Their dreams of championships, of scholarships, of futures built on the foundation of what we were creating together this season. I thought about Coach Williams, who had taken a chance on both of us when other programs might have offered more prestigious opportunities. Williams had built his entire system around the leadership dynamic between Grant and me, had structured plays and strategies that relied on our ability to read each other's movements, to anticipate each other's decisions with the kind of telepathic connection that only came from complete trust. What would happen to that trust if it became something else entirely? I thought about my parents, who drove 3 hours to every home game, who had sacrificed vacations and luxuries to pay for basketball camps and training sessions since I was 12 years old. My father, who had coached my youth league teams and taught me to see basketball as more than a game, but as a crucible where character was forged. My mother, who kept scrapbooks of every newspaper clipping, every small mention of my progress toward the dreams we had built together. How could I explain to them that everything they had invested in was about to be risked for something they might never understand? But even as these thoughts raced through my mind, I was aware of Grant's steady breathing, of the warmth radiating from his body, of the way his presence had become as essential to me as oxygen. The past few weeks had shown me what it felt like to want something so completely that everything else seemed pale by comparison. I had always been the careful one, the one who weighed risks and consequences before making any significant decision. But standing there in Grant's hands, I realized that some choices couldn't be made through logic or careful calculation. Some choices had to be made with the part of yourself that knew truths your mind wasn't ready to accept. Grant must have seen something shift in my expression, because his hands tightened slightly against my face, his dark eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my chest ache. "I can't promise it will be easy," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't promise we won't get caught. Can't promise it won't cost us everything we've worked for. But I can promise that if you walk away now, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what we could have been." The honesty in his words was devastating. Grant Mitchell, who had never met a challenge he couldn't overcome, was admitting that this was bigger than both of us, more dangerous than anything we had faced on any basketball court. And then he said the words that changed everything. "Say no, and I'll never ask again. Say yes, and I'm yours." The choice crystallized in that moment with perfect, terrifying clarity. Not just a choice about whether to kiss him, or touch him, or explore the electricity that had been building between us for weeks, but a choice about what kind of life I wanted to live. Whether I would choose safety and certainty and the approval of everyone who mattered to me, or whether I would choose the kind of love that felt like coming home and jumping off a cliff simultaneously. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, could hear the sound of my own breathing amplified in the silence of the empty gym. Grant's eyes never left mine, but I could see the vulnerability there, the way he was bracing himself for rejection while hoping for something else entirely. The logical part of my mind cataloged all the reasons to say no. The risks were real, the consequences potentially devastating. We were weeks away from the biggest games of our careers, months away from decisions about our futures that could be influenced by what happened in this moment. But logic had never accounted for the way Grant looked at me, like I was something precious and dangerous and essential all at once. Logic had never explained why my chest felt hollow when he was absent, why every room felt smaller when he was in it, why his laugh had become the sound I most wanted to hear at the end of difficult days. Logic had never explained why loving him felt like the most natural thing in the world. I reached up and covered his hands with mine, feeling the calluses on his palms from years of basketball, feeling the slight tremor that proved he was just as terrified as I was. The entire gymnasium seemed to hold its breath as I made the choice that would define everything that came after. Yes, I whispered, and the word felt like stepping off the edge of the world. Grant's eyes closed for a moment, relief and something deeper washing over his face like sunrise. When he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears and a joy so pure it made my chest ache. Then he was kissing me, soft and desperate and perfect, and I understood for the first time why people wrote songs about moments like this, why they started wars and abandoned kingdoms and risked everything for love. Because some things were worth the cost, regardless of what that cost might be. The clock on the gymnasium wall read 2:47 a.m. when we finally stopped kissing. We sat on the bench at center court, the same bench where Coach Williams delivered his pre-game speeches, where we had celebrated victories and mourned defeats, where the weight of 3 years' worth of dreams and expectations had pressed down on us like stones. Now it felt different, sacred in a way that had nothing to do with basketball and everything to do with the quiet revolution that had just taken place in the space between us. Grant's jacket was draped around my shoulders, though I couldn't remember when he had put it there. The heavy cotton still held his warmth, still carried the faint scent of his cologne mixed with the clean smell of laundered fabric. I pulled it tighter around myself, not because I was cold, but because wearing something of his felt like proof that what had happened was real. The gymnasium was dim, lit only by the emergency lighting that cast everything in soft shadows. During games, this space filled with 3,000 screaming fans, with the chaos of competition and the electric energy of young men pushing themselves beyond their limits. But now, in the profound stillness of the early morning hours, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. Grant sat beside me, close enough that our thighs touched, his hand resting on my knee with a casualness that would have been impossible just hours earlier. He wasn't looking at me. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the opposite end of the court, where the championship banners hung like promises in the darkness. But I could feel the contentment radiating from him, a kind of peace I had never seen in him before. Neither of us spoke. What was there to say? We had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had made a choice that would ripple through every aspect of our lives from this moment forward. The weight of that decision sat between us, but it felt manageable now, shared rather than carried alone. I pressed my palm against the smooth wood of the court beneath us, grounding myself in the familiar texture. This floor had witnessed every significant moment of my college career. The first practice where I proved I belonged, the games where I had pushed past my own limitations, the countless hours of preparation that had brought us to the threshold of everything we had worked toward. Now it would also hold the memory of this night, of the moment when Grant Mitchell and I stopped pretending we were just teammates and admitted we were something else entirely. Grant shifted beside me, and when I looked at him, he was watching me with an expression I was still learning to read. Not the careful mask he wore during practice or the confident smile he showed to teammates and coaches, but something quieter, more vulnerable, something that was just for me. "What happens now?" I asked, though the question came out as barely more than a whisper. Grant was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing gentle circles against my knee through the fabric of my sweatpants. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had been thinking about this question for longer than either of us had been willing to admit. "We played basketball," he said simply. "We win the conference championship. We graduate. We figure out the rest as we go." It sounded almost mundane when he put it like that, but I understood what he meant. The world outside this gymnasium hadn't changed. We still had responsibilities, expectations, dreams that extended beyond whatever this was becoming between us. But the foundation had shifted, and everything would be built on different ground now. "We'll be careful," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "We'll be smart about it. But I'm not going back to pretending I don't feel this way about you. I can't." I nodded, understanding perfectly. The past few weeks of dancing around our attraction, of stolen glances and carefully casual touches, had been torture for both of us. At least now, we would be moving forward with honesty, even if that honesty had to remain hidden from everyone else. Grant leaned back against the bench, his free hand reaching up to run through his hair in a gesture I had seen him make 1,000 times during games when he was thinking through strategy. But tonight, it seemed less calculated, more relaxed. "You know what's funny?" he said, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I used to think the hardest thing about being team captain was getting everyone to believe in themselves enough to play at their potential. Turns out the hardest thing was trying to convince myself I didn't want something I couldn't have. I leaned into him then, letting my head rest against his shoulder the way it had during that bus ride sophomore year. The moment he had mentioned earlier, when neither of us had understood what was happening, but both of us had felt the shift. His arm came around me automatically, holding me against his side with the kind of protective tenderness that made my chest ache. The clock ticked toward 3 a.m., but neither of us made any move to leave. Today really, we would return to our carefully constructed roles. Grant would be the team captain, the leader everyone looked to for strength and direction. I would be the dependable player who executed every assignment with quiet precision. We would run plays and attend meetings and prepare for the games that would determine whether this season ended in glory or disappointment. But something fundamental had changed in the space between us, something that couldn't be undone by daylight or the return of coaches and teammates and the weight of expectation. We had chosen each other, despite the risks, despite the consequences, despite every rational reason to walk away. In the profound quiet of the empty gymnasium, with Grant's arms around me and his jacket warming my shoulders, I felt something I had never experienced before. Not just desire or affection or the thrill of forbidden love, but a sense of completeness that made everything else feel secondary. The world outside would continue to spin, demanding performance and excellence and adherence to rules we had just broken. But here, in this moment, we had everything we needed. Grant's breathing had grown slow and steady, and I realized he might be falling asleep against me. The thought made me smile. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own complications, and careful negotiations. But tonight we had the quiet knowledge that we belonged to each other, regardless of what anyone else might think. I closed my eyes and let myself sink into the peace of it, into the revolutionary quiet of love acknowledged and accepted. In a few hours, the sun would rise, and we would return to the world of basketball and expectations and carefully maintained facades. But the door we had opened tonight would remain open, no matter what else happened. And that felt like victory enough.